Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's TA Talk, or Technical Assistance Talk, on loneliness and social isolation and long-term care. My name is Amity Overall-Labe, and I'm the NORT Director. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Next slide, please. I hope that this is not your first TA Talk, but if it is, welcome. So glad that you're here. These TA Talks are designed to be informal conversations that we have quarterly on specific topics. They're hosted on Zoom, as you know, because you're here right now, and live streamed on Facebook. You are encouraged to share your expertise and experiences during these calls so we can have some peer-to-peer support and all learn from each other. Since this is a Zoom meeting, there will be an opportunity for you to unmute yourself and ask questions via audio instead of on the webinar where it's just in the Q&A box. So feel free as the presentations go to enter your questions in the chat. Or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to share your questions at the end. We are recording this meeting, and the recording and PowerPoint will be emailed to all the registrants as well as our entire network, so everyone should get it. At the end of the meeting, I will make a reminder, but just putting that in there now, please complete the evaluation questionnaire. We will also issue certificates of participation to those that joined today's call for at least 30 minutes and joined via Zoom, not the Facebook Live. All links and resources will be posted in the chat and shared on our website. And of course, don't forget, if you have ideas for future topics, because again, we do these quarterly, please email us. We are open to your ideas. We want to hear what you want to learn about. Next slide. And you may recall from the registration information that we shared, we strongly encourage that y'all listen to this podcast before joining today's call. If you haven't yet listened to it, that is more than okay. Please stay on the line for today's call, but I wanted to point out you can listen to it afterwards in a variety of ways, including I believe Jocelyn is going to speak about the podcast during her remarks as well. Next slide. We are very pleased to have these excellent speakers with us today to discuss preventing and addressing loneliness and social isolation in long-term care. First, we'll hear from Lori Smetanka, Executive Director, and Jocelyn Bogdan, Senior Program and Policy Specialist of Consumer Voice. They'll talk about loneliness and social isolation in long-term care generally, how staff, family members, and others can work to ensure residents are heard, and share a brand new resource that hasn't even been posted on the website yet, so y'all are first to hear about it. After their remarks, Monique Turner of the New Jersey Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program's Social Isolation Project, or SIP, will share information about how the SIP serves residents. After you hear from our speakers, we'll open it up for questions and for hearing directly from you about your experience in this area. So please enter your questions in the chat at any time, or be ready to raise your hand later in that discussion. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori and Jocelyn. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm Jocelyn Bogdan with Consumer Voice, and I am going to start off talking somewhat generally about social isolation and loneliness in long-term care today. And Lori is going to jump in when needed or follow up if needed. So recently, and in a very timely manner for us at Consumer Voice, because we were already talking about this issue and planning to work on it, and actually working on it, the US Surgeon General called the epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the United States a public health crisis with profound consequences, and he focused on the need to prioritize social connections. As we all know too well, social isolation and loneliness are big problems, yes, in the larger world, but specifically in long-term care. During the pandemic, there probably wasn't any community that was more adversely impacted by loneliness and isolation than people in long-term care. We all saw what happened when visitation was shut down and residents were confined to their rooms. They often had their doors closed and they were completely cut off, often with dire consequences. Those consequences were physical, emotional, and psychosocial. And while the pandemic really shined a light on these issues, social isolation and loneliness were problems before COVID, and they will continue to be problems as COVID recedes. Studies have found that 25% of Americans over 65 are socially isolated and 43% are lonely. And it's even worse in long-term care, where half of all nursing home residents report feeling lonely. And so one thing I want to start off by emphasizing is that social isolation and loneliness are often conflated together, but these are two very separate issues. Social isolation is a physical and objective state of being alone, and it can be a choice. Some people like to be alone, and that's great. They can be alone and they can be happy, and that's fabulous. But for others, people find themselves socially isolated when it is not their choice. And this can often be the case for residents in long-term care, not just during the pandemic, but in a nursing home that's understaffed, where their needs make it more difficult for them to move around, where there isn't the help that people need and the support to visit with other residents, to attend activities, and where residents end up spending a lot of time alone in their rooms. In these cases, where social isolation is not a choice, it can lead to loneliness, and it can have negative health consequences, and it can also sometimes lead to abuse and neglect. Loneliness is less objective. It's how you feel. You can be lonely in a crowded room, or you can be lonely by yourself. It's subjective. It doesn't matter how many people are or are not around you. And there's more than one way for a person to feel lonely, or more than one type of loneliness or situation where loneliness can occur. So, and we go over this in the fact sheet that I'm going to mention, but there's personal loneliness. And that's the loneliness that you feel if something happens to your spouse or your significant other or your partner or a close friend, when that person is suddenly gone and you have a gap in your life now. And then there's also loneliness where you lose a community, but like a small community, a group of people you might knit with or do a book club with, people who you're used to connecting with. For me, that community is probably other parents at my kids' school who I sometimes go out to dinner with, but a group of friends. So if you move away from those friends, or if you somehow leave that group, that's a different kind of loneliness when you don't have those people to connect with anymore. And then there's a broader loneliness when you lose a larger group of people, like your religious group or a larger community. And in the podcast we did with Susan Weary, at the end,
Well, the heater off, okay?
Sorry. Actually, I think it was actually in a conversation we had before the podcast. She was telling me that there were people during the pandemic who she spoke with who felt incredible loneliness when facilities got shut down. And this sounds a little bit surprising, but she said that when they were watching their church services on television, it helped them dramatically, because even though they weren't there in church surrounded by people, they felt a connection to that larger group and community when they were watching the church service on TV, even though they were separated from them physically. So that small act of putting something like that on television made a difference to them. But we will get to how we can help later. But people experienced many kinds of loneliness during the pandemic, and you can experience multiple kinds of loneliness at once. We all experienced loss, but again, people in nursing homes and in assisted livings and in long-term care experienced more loss than many of us. When you think about the people in long-term care who were cut off from their loved ones who were visiting them, when they were cut off from a group of residents that maybe they played games with or spent time with, when they were cut off from their larger community, we saw the consequences. I remember one family member, and she always stands out, who said that her father was extremely depressed during the initial facility lockdowns. It was just really, really hard for him, but he got through it. And when his nursing home opened up again, he started to do better. He was so happy to be back with his family, to be back with his friends and his community. And then his facility locked down again, and he gave up. He couldn't do it anymore. She said his decline happened really fast. He just didn't have a reason to keep living. I talked to another family member just last week, and we were actually talking about something completely different. Another issue he was having with another person in his life, but he started talking to me about a friend who was in a facility during COVID who declined as soon as the facilities locked down. He lost his mobility. He went from being able to walk around the facility, being completely mobile, to being completely bedridden. And this person I was talking to, he called with a different issue, but he was so upset 2 years later. He just kept saying that this never should have happened to his friend. And he's right. We heard these stories over and over and over through the pandemic. Children who would call and say their mother was walking around before the lockdowns, and then who couldn't do window visits because their mother couldn't sit up in bed anymore. We all know how people declined and died from the pandemic for reasons that weren't COVID-19 itself. And so chronic loneliness is associated with adverse medical and mental health conditions. It can increase the risk of dementia by nearly 50%. But it also has other health consequences. It can really impact your entire body. And this is something that, again, if you haven't listened to the podcast with Susan Weary, she talks so eloquently about this, how your entire body is sort of impacted by the state you're in when you feel lonely. But it can lead to anxiety, it can lead to suicidal thoughts, to stroke, to obesity, to heart disease, to high blood pressure, to cognitive decline, and more. And we certainly saw the cognitive and physical decline during the pandemic. A few months ago, we had a conversation with residents about loneliness. We actually had 2 different conversations at different times with a few different residents who joined. But in both conversations, when we asked what people could do to help combat loneliness in long-term care, the answer was exactly the same. They said, listen to us. And in fact, 2 different residents in those conversations talked about what they did to help other residents in their own facilities deal with loneliness. They talked about how they both visited with residents in their facilities who had dementia, and they talked to them and listened to their stories. So one resident we spoke with was saying that she speaks to a woman who's normally very quiet and reserved and doesn't engage with people, but she goes and she sits down with her and she talks to her. And this other resident starts telling her these stories from her childhood and about how she grew up, and she gets so engaged, this resident who has dementia, when she's talking, and she's so happy to share those stories. And then on this call, the other resident who we were speaking with was agreeing and saying she actually does the exact same thing in her facility. She visits with different people in her facility who have dementia and talks to them because no one else has time to do that. They don't have visitors, the staff doesn't have time, and it gives these residents something to do, and it helps their neighbors within their facility. And I actually think one of the earlier conversations we had with residents about loneliness is part of what spawned Consumer Voice to start our resident-led conversations with our Consumer Advisory Council. So we often meet with our Consumer Advisory Council to talk about important issues and things going on. But last year, we started setting up calls where members just talk to each other about their own work and the advocacy they're doing in their own facilities, because they get lonely living in long-term care, doing the work that they do. And this creates an outlet for them to build a community of other resident advocates. So if anyone on this call knows of anyone who might be interested in joining our Consumer Advisory Council and getting involved with that, please let me know. You can just send me an email. Before I talk about some of the other ways to help, I actually wanted to share a few quotes from different long-term care consumers that came out of those discussions about what loneliness and isolation in their facilities is like. And you will see some of these quotes in our new fact sheet that's going to be out any day now. But I just wanted to share them with you because I think they're really powerful. So Terry, a wonderful member of our Consumer Advisory Council from Pennsylvania, shared this about living in her nursing home during and after COVID. She said, "While it was hard for my family to visit me during COVID, that has always been true. But now, having lost all the friends I've lost during COVID, friends who died and friends who left the facility, the loneliness is now also grief." And to me, that goes back to the reality that there are many ways to be lonely. And while we all assume that things got better when facilities reopened, we're ignoring the loss that residents experience when we assume that. She lost her friends and her neighbors, and she never really had family that came to visit, which is true of many, many residents. Another quote comes from Maurice, who is an incredible resident and advocate. His facility reopened for visitation when it was required to, but until very, very recently, it continued to isolate residents in their room anytime there was a COVID-19 case in the facility. He shared, "I don't mix and mingle much in my facility because it's difficult for me to get into my wheelchair. Isolation can happen even if you have a roommate because at times all the doors are shut. Even when the big COVID-19 lockdown ended and visitor restrictions ended, and the residents who didn't have visitors, whose only friends were fellow residents, were still lonely because we weren't allowed to move around the facility. This still happens when there are COVID-19 outbreaks. And so I think very recently, that's kind of started to recede, but this was going on until a month or two ago. And the final quote I want to share is from another amazing advocate, Floyd, who's no longer living in long-term care, but he works to help others who are re-entering the world from their facilities. And what he said added a whole new dimension to this and really emphasized how hard it is when people leave their long-term care facility. He said, a lot of people think once they move back into the community, family is going to gather around and they'll have all that support. But then they find out that support isn't there. They're all alone, especially during COVID. They're all alone trying to find their way and regroup as far as socializing. That just doesn't happen. I know people who died because of not having anyone around them. You're in a strange setting, starting over again, but not having the resources to help you, not having a peer mentor. And so, as you'll see when we release our fact sheet in the next few days, we do offer some suggestions, what friends, family, staff, facilities can do to combat unwanted social isolation and loneliness. And I think a lot of what you'll see is somewhat self-explanatory or obvious, but asking residents themselves how to support them and what would help address their loneliness is very important. Visiting, calling, sending messages when you can't call, sending pre-recorded messages. Another big one and newer is the use of technology. Having an Alexa or a Google Home device in their room so you can drop in and visit. I do this when I'm away from my kids. We have Alexas in every room and there's an app on my phone. It's a little bit creepy, but one of our devices is called an Echo Show, which means it has a screen and I can actually drop in and see what's happening in the room. I don't have to call, they don't have to answer. I can click a button and suddenly it's like having a camera in the room. And then the kids can see me on the screen too. And I think as the current population ages, we're going to start to see more and more pop up about the importance of technology and the accessibility of technology in long-term care. I mean, I think these are problems we're already starting to see. There are also suggestions of becoming involved in family councils and helping get residents involved in resident councils. And I cannot tell you how many family members I have spoken to who themselves, I think, feel really alone in their advocacy. And when I ask them if there's a family council they can work with, they don't know. So I think ensuring that families realize this is something that can help them. If it isn't there, they can help set it up is really important. And then finding other ways to keep residents engaged. And again, we can turn to technology. We can look to online book clubs, to online classes. I mean, a whole world of online things sprouted up from the pandemic. Religious services and facilities also have a role here. And we have a list on the fact sheet of suggestions for facilities as well. They really need to be working to engage residents and ensure that they have access to what they need. They should also be encouraging community engagement. For residents who can't go out, the facility should be helping the community to come in. I know I've shared on webinars before that when my son, who's in elementary school now, was in nursery school, his school was across the street. His nursery school was across the street from a nursing home. And the kids went over and sang songs for Halloween and Valentine's Day. And that was the year before the pandemic started. And I know all of that stopped and shut down through the pandemic. I was really happy this year to see on his preschool's Instagram that they're doing those things again. Those visits are happening. The kids are going several times a year to visit with residents in the nursing home. But there are lots of innovative ways to get the community engaged, and facilities should be helping to make that happen. They should also be ensuring that residents' needs are met. And at the end of the day, I go back to what the residents shared, that what they really need is someone to listen. And so like so many other things, this also ties into staffing. Residents need adequate staffing levels so they have the care and the support that they need. And so that is basically what I have to share. Again, our new fact sheet is going to be coming out any day. The next slide is just, again, a link to our podcast. As I mentioned, as Amity mentioned, as I know she told you, we did this podcast with the amazing Dr. Susan Weary. She has so much to offer and share about this topic. I learned so much from listening to her. So if you haven't yet, I really urge you listen to it. And with that, I will offer Lori the chance to make any comments and turn it back over to Amity.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And I think you raised so many really important points. I think, one for me that we just really have to remember as advocates is that, as Jocelyn pointed out, so many residents that live in long-term care facilities do not have regular visitors. The statistics are as high as 60 to 70% of residents don't have anyone that is coming to regularly visit with them. And so we need to really be thinking about how we can be advocating for them in many of the ways that Jocelyn talked about, to not only help them engage with others and have connection with others, but how the facility can help them, how resident and family councils can be developed and supported to also provide support to the residents, so that we aren't facing situations where people are lonely when they are seeking connection. And that is also true not just for residents who are cognitively intact, but also those who have dementia or have some cognitive impairments. They also need to have some level of connection and engagement with others in order to help not experience loneliness and isolation. And as Jocelyn pointed out again, not only do they have effects that are physical, psychosocial, emotional when a person feels lonely and isolated, but they are at greater risk for abuse and neglect. And that is something that we want to all avoid. So thank you to Jocelyn for her comments, and we'll turn it back over to Amity and Monique for her remarks.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you so much, Lori. All right, Monique, you are up. Can't wait to hear more about this project.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Consumer Voice for having me on to talk about the social isolation program that we have at our office. I've worked in long-term care for over 20 years. I'm a social worker, and I also have my nursing home administrator's license. I've been with the New Jersey LTCO for about 2 years now, working in the social isolation program. In 2020, our office received $530,000 in COVID-related Federal CARES Act funding. Our Ombudsman, Laurie Brewer, saw that there was such a need in the facilities for us to get in there to see how this isolation was affecting the residents. The office used the money to hire 3 full-time temporary social workers, I'm one of them, and to proactively visit facilities during the COVID pandemic. We also hired 2 additional nurses to handle the increase in cases that we were seeing. Our cases have actually doubled in the past 3 years, from about 3,500 to 7,000 that is expected this year. The program was so successful that when the CARES Act funds ran out, the state increased the LTCO budget to hire the 5 temporary staff, which of course I was very happy about. The social isolation program began first to get into the facilities and assess how residents were doing. In the beginning, a lot of our work was about loosening the grip the facilities had on visitations. First, the compassionate care visits, then the outside visitations, and then eventually when they brought the visits inside. We looked at the recreation programs to assist the facilities in creatively continuing to provide engaging activities to the residents. As the new Department of Health guidelines changed and things were opening up, we visited facilities and educated the administration on the new guidelines. Many times I've served as a liaison between the Department of Health, the local health department, and the facilities, trying to open things up, first with the visitations, then with communal dining, then with communal activities, and even during outbreaks. Just recently, I had gotten an email from a resident council president at a facility where they were still requiring the staff members as well as visitors to wear masks going into the facility, and they were feeling really frustrated by that. So I visited the facility, met with the administration there, and just talked with them about what I was seeing at the other facilities I was visiting, that basically no one was wearing masks, that they were optional. We also reviewed the Department of Health guidelines to kind of show where things had changed now and it was no longer a mandate. And by the end of the week, I had received an email from the director of nursing and that resident council president. I'm so happy because visitors and staff were no longer having to wear the masks. That's an example of, some of the things that we do when we get into the facilities. The social isolation program has really grown since it started. Jennifer McMahon, who's our Chief of Advocacy Services, really developed the program. We now have six people out in the field working in the program, covering the north, central, and southern parts of the state. We regularly visit facilities to have a more proactive approach. We do wellness checks on the residents, addressing issues before they become complaints to our office. We've developed a regular presence in all of these facilities and have developed really good relationships with the residents, the staff, and the administrations there. We will attend resident council meetings, we'll do resident rights bingos, and we'll also conduct environmental scans. Basically we'll go to the facility and we'll be looking around, is there enough lighting there? Is the facility clean? Is there any odors? Are the residents dressed in personalized clothing? Do they look clean? Is the programming, the activity programming there suitable for the population that lives there? Are the residents getting outside time? Are they able to get some fresh air? So we'll look at all of these things and also talk to the residents and ask them, how's the food here? How do you like the activities that are going on here? Is there anything that you would like to see, happen, better for your living environment? And at the end of our visit, we'll sit with the administration and first of all, address any of the individual complaints that the residents gave us permission to talk about. And then we'll just go overview of our findings and our recommendations of how to improve things there. And we let them know that we're a resource to use, that if you're having an issue or you want some creative things to do with your activity programming, we're here to support you. So I feel like this program has become such a benefit to the residents. They like that we're coming into the facility, checking on them to see how they're doing and advocating for them regularly and proactively. I'm so happy and so proud to be a part of the program. That's pretty much an overview of what we do. If anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Monique. Really glad that y'all are able to secure funding to continue this work and keep those 5 staff on to expand access to your program. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we have plenty of time on the call today for sharing of your experiences out in the field, questions you have for our presenters, any resources or training that you do specific in this area. So feel free to drop questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can let you know to unmute so you can ask your question using audio. And while folks are thinking, because I'm double checking for hands raised, Monique, just to be really clear, it sounds like, and I don't want to misstate anything, so definitely correct me, but did most of your Ombudsman program representatives, the paid representatives, respond to complaints? And that was their main focus? Because I know you mentioned during your visits, you scan the environment, you check for, things that a lot of folks consider would be a routine access visit. So it just seems like y'all are given the opportunity to be more proactive with these additional staff on board. Is that correct? Or am I mistaken?
Yes, I mean, they're actually called SIP visits and we go there unannounced. We do go out on complaints also, but we try to really come out with this proactive approach rather than waiting for the complaint and then we go out. So we just kind of show up unannounced, let them know, that we're here to do a wellness check on the residents. As things started back in 2020 up till now, most of the facilities we visit know what the SIP program is and what we do. In the beginning, it was a little bit of an education of what we're here for. And I think now they're pretty open to us coming in because, we're there to actually help a little bit. And if there's any problem areas or expand on things that maybe they're having trouble with. So they've actually welcomed it at this point.
Great. And a couple questions in the chat for you. Someone's asking, Brenda, thank you. If you can get a copy of the questions that you and the other SIP folks ask during these visits of residents.
Sure, I can definitely put something together and send it to you. And if you could forward it to everyone, that would be great. I definitely can do that.
Excellent. Yes, we'd be happy to include that as one of our resources. And Cindy asked, how often do visits occur in this project?
So like I said, we have people who are in the north, central, and southern areas. So we definitely divide up the facilities. We will, I know when I first started, I made sure to visit every facility so they got to know who I was. And then I would say every couple of months, every 3 months, we'll go back to some facilities. The facilities that need a little more help, that maybe aren't doing as well, we'll visit a lot more frequently. There'll be an ongoing, like every 2 weeks, we'll go out and check and see how they're doing and if they're following up on the recommendations that we had suggested. So it kind of depends on the facility. If they're doing great and the residents are thriving and, they have these great activity programs and everybody's getting outside and they're having trips, maybe we'll visit them every, 3 months, but there's a lot more troubled facilities that require a lot more visits. And you kind of don't know that until you start visiting and seeing what's out there.
Thank you. Patricia asked if you find that activities in homes tend to be geared towards particular residents. I think that was based on one of your questions.
I think what we're noticing, obviously you have residents with dementia and then you have more alert and oriented residents. So you want to see the activities kind of geared towards that. But we're also noticing that there's a younger population that's entering a lot of the nursing homes with different issues, some are mental health, some are addiction issues. So it really is looking at your population that's at that facility. And if the activities, aren't bingo and your general things that you see all the time, if you're really gearing those activities to the people that live there. And we, come in and help to develop that as well. It's not like we're coming in and saying, your activities are awful. We sit with the activities director and the administrator and kind of suggest things, and we'll come out and do things with them to try to engage the residents a little bit more.
And whenever you're having these conversations, I guess depending on the population you're working with, I assume kind of similar to complaint resolution, when you encourage a resident to come with you to talk to the administrator or director of nursing, you'd pull in residents for their feedback on activities and
well, that's one of the first things we do is we just go visit residents in their rooms and just ask them, questions, especially like, how is the food? How do you like the activities here? Do you get to go out? Are you doing things that you like to do? And, we take that feedback. If the residents want to remain anonymous, obviously we just, say it's a general consensus of what we're seeing, but definitely for specific issues that residents want to address, we sit in on meetings with them too.
Excellent. Let's see some other questions. Do we have anything for group homes in North Carolina specifically? So remind everyone, including myself, do you visit all settings, so nursing facilities as well as different types of assisted living, residential care communities?
We will go into long-term care, assisted living, independent living, and the boarding homes. We're actually just developing a program where we have separate staff to go into the boarding homes and do the same type of thing. It's just beginning. It's in the very initial phases, but we are growing and developing that as well.
Great. And Brenda's asked, if your project is so successful, is there some type of almost template that other states could adopt in their state?
Definitely. I think I would connect you with Laurie and Jennifer McMahon, who, really developed the program from the beginning, and it's just really evolved as we've been going. I know that we would be more than happy to share what we do and, give you like a template of how we do it. And it would be so great to see this in other states. So maybe we can connect somehow. I don't know if my information is on this webinar, but anybody wants to connect with me, they
did.
definitely can.
I took the liberty of putting your contact information.
Okay.
So yes, definitely folks in the slides, and I'll show you at the end your contact information for Monique. And then of course, you can always reach out to us and we'll put you in touch with them as well.
Perfect.
Dale asked, we've had some resistance from some facilities with technology, and Dale, you're certainly not alone. We've heard other states say the same thing. So residents using Echo, those type of things, as the facilities define them as listening devices and consider that they're violating privacy. So have you run into that, Monique, or Jocelyn or Lori have any feedback for that?
I have run into that. It is a difficult spot. I mean, with roommates and things like that. But, you know, our goal when we go in is to try to work something out to make it possible. So, you know, with the privacy issues, it definitely presents a little bit of a complication, but there's ways around that. If you want to time, you know, I mean, just thinking off the top of my head, if you wanted to time morning visits and, you know, the resident can go into, you know, a common area that's, you know, still kind of private and have that face-to-face. There's ways around that if they're just worried about, you know, privacy and things like that. I mean, that's part of what we do is try to look at a problem and come up with a creative solution like that.
And I think that's a really important point in terms of thinking through what are solutions that can be identified in order for the resident to have that engagement with, again, the person of their choice. And I think what the pandemic showed us is that technology is going to have a new and I think growing place in all of our lives. And while in the past, we've all talked quite a bit about the use of surveillance cameras, for example, or different types of devices in rooms, and some states have even passed laws or rules with respect to that. The way technology is being used today and with advances, I think we're all going to have to be thinking about it in a new and creative way. I think we should not accept just blanket no's that this isn't allowed, and continue to advocate for residents to be able to use them while also working to protect the privacy of roommates or other residents.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Lori just said. I mean, I know she and I have talked about this a little bit ourselves, but that's the reason I brought it up. I do think that as we have, you know, an ever-aging population, we're going to start to see more and more people entering facilities who are reliant and who have used this technology and who have come to expect it. So I don't think that means there aren't going to be issues. I think there are going to be issues that we have to deal with and figure out, but I do think this is sort of like a whole new world that is coming to facilities in a way. And it's something we all need to, as Lori said, be thinking creatively about, because it's going to be there. And someday we all may be in nursing homes, and we are certainly all used to all of this technology. So it's going to be a different world moving forward.
Agreed. And a lot of folks that are in long-term care facilities right now may even use them just because of their disabilities, to turn on lights, to call. So very used to integrating that in their life. And I think Monique's ideas, Lori, Jocelyn, and then of course, just working one-on-one, it's very possible. And as you said, don't just take no for an answer. If the facility is saying no, talk to the other resident. It's very possible the other resident has no issue with it at all. And so as long as the two residents that are experiencing and using that technology in that one room, then that's not a violation of privacy if they're both comfortable with it. And they may have fun with it, to play their own music and entertainment and whatnot. So, and if anyone else that's listening in and wants to share any thoughts if they've encountered this in your work, please do. So there is a comment in the chat that I'm sure some folks would like to speak to. From my observation as an ombudsman, I've noticed that residents are not eating in facility dining rooms. Dining in their own room became the norm during the COVID crisis, of course, but it's now stayed the norm. Facility administration and clinical staff are satisfied with not taking residents to the dining room and eating lunch and dinner there. So eating in the dining room was a real value to socialization. Any suggestion for getting back to having residents access to the dining room to increase socialization? Thank you, Peter. That's a good observation and a great question. Anyone have thoughts on that or experiences?
When we've been going out to the facilities, that was one of the first things that we were seeing, that first, staffing wise and convenience wise, the dining rooms were not open. So that was definitely an obstacle that we addressed with the administrators, because the dining rooms do need to be open. And you know, you're very right that that's so important for residents on a socialization level, and just even so that the food's hot, and you know, just for so many reasons. The one problem is a lot of residents got used to eating there and didn't want to come to the dining room. So that was a part of a challenge as well. But we would work with the facilities, you know, trying to engage in special dining events, you know, whether it was, you know, breakfast omelets made to order or some kind of breakfast event, or you know, I've had residents do like a fine dining night where they do prime rib, or even just a pizza party. Like the facilities had to be encouraged to be more creative to get the residents out of their room to the dining room. But any facility that I encounter that doesn't have a dining room open, which there isn't really any anymore, you know, that's for us, we would be talking about how are you going to be opening your dining room? Basically, there shouldn't be. And even with the residents, not as many of them going to the dining room, they should still have that opportunity if they want to.
I also wonder about engaging a resident council if this is the situation, and working with the resident council to encourage residents to go to the dining room, to even do some of the things that Monique is talking about, and help them advocate in that way as well, and working with them to really help empower them and to empower other residents to focus on what is a way to reopen the dining room, get people more interested in coming back into that setting and engaging in that way.
Thanks, Lori. Thanks, Monique. I love the idea of special dining events, and especially making your own omelets and pizza nights. I think that's really creative. And of course, engaging the resident council in the future. I'm very curious, similar to folks being comfortable with using technology, I think people are more aware of sensory input. And I'm very curious, I would love to see this as an opportunity to redesign how dining occurs, period. Just for my own preference, I know I wouldn't want to eat in a dining room with 100 other residents at the same time. So it'd be really great if we had some models of that, to where they're breaking apart, either staggering meal times or breaking apart in smaller rooms. I'd love to see some best practices in that area. It'd be less overwhelming for, I'm sure, a lot of residents, especially those with cognitive issues. All right, thank you, Bev, for dropping that resource about dining in the chat. And good question about longer, residents wanting to have longer conversations with Ombudsman simply for a way to communicate and have meaningful connection with somebody, so your visits are longer. Looks like there's a lot of folks agreeing with that. Any other questions or comments? What are you all seeing in the field, or are you seeing any best practices you'd like to share as facilities are coming out of the pandemic, and how they're supporting residents to ensure that they're not isolated and that they're engaging to the level that they want to engage in? And of course, I know I'm speaking to the choir, but I forgot to mention about the dining issue, that yes, facility staff should be encouraging residents to go, and encouraging them to go often, because, you know, I may not feel like going down the dining hall today, but maybe tomorrow I do. And if no one asks me to go down or encourages me, then I would just eat in my room. So of course, you know, continue to ask those questions and encourage staff to do the same, of course. So any examples you have to share, or other questions for our speakers? Okay. I don't see any hands at the moment. Next slide, Libby. Oh, here we go. A complaint about food. Something I'm hearing more and more is about the quality of food. Too many carbs are being served, and many residents are not happy with the choices, and so they choose not to go to the dining room. Okay, so the root cause is actually just the quality of the food, and not so much that they want to stay in their room. That's an excellent point. One of the homes took residents on a fishing trip. That's excellent. I would love that. That's great to hear. Thanks for sharing that, Elda. And portions are very small. Robotic pets. All right, now the best practices are coming in, streaming in. So robotic pets in some of our facilities to help with loneliness. Thank you for sharing that, Dale. And if there's something in the chat that folks are sharing that you want to hear more about, then definitely speak up. So one question, is there a resource for activities for residents who are not experiencing any mental deficits that I could suggest? Lori, y'all have any ideas? I have ideas, but I want to let y'all speak first.
Well, so there are whole ranges of activities that are accessible, for example, through the National Association of Activities Professionals. On their website, they have a lot of resources that people can engage with. As we are thinking about Residents' Rights Month in October, we at the Consumer Voice post ranges of activities on our website under the Residents' Rights Month, on the Residents' Rights Month pages of things that can be done to engage people either in conversation or in different activities, including we have an activity or enrichment book that we've released the last couple of years, and a new one will be coming out soon. I do think that there are a number of resources that can be obtained online on some of those places that I thought about. Again, this is another area where I would engage the resident council and other residents and talk to them about what are activities that they would like to be engaged in and things that they would like to be doing. If the facility is only offering bingo, for example, or things that people aren't interested in, then we need to be thinking broader. They need to be thinking broader about what's being offered and how they can help residents engage or become involved in different things that they are more interested in, whether that be inside the facility, whether that be in the community, whether that be bringing people into the facility, like, artists, for example, or classes, or, different types of things. So, I think that, I know that's very general, but hopefully by talking to residents and by in terms of getting things that they're interested in, as well as doing some search on both the Consumer Voice site and the Activities Professional site, I think that there are a range of options that can be used and adapted.
Thanks, Lori. Yes, I was thinking of the National Association as well. So I dropped in that link to the website. And as Lori mentioned, of course, Resident Rights Month activities, which is coming up, and you can start talking about and sharing now with residents. I'd like to also make a suggestion that as advocates, whenever you're working with facility staff, make sure that these questions are part of their initial intake and assessment of residents, not just about their medical care and those needs. Make sure it's a whole life assessment about what they're interested in, and that that's followed up on during the care plan meetings, and of course, intermittently as needed. I think making sure that that focus is there would be really helpful. And of course, getting residents involved, the resident council and so on, with making those decisions. So let's see. our programs encourage the activity directors to reach out to local grammar schools to get children involved in making craft items or coming to the facility. Excellent. And art, of course, can be therapeutic, whether you're just doodling or you have one of those adult coloring books, sketchbooks, etc. Can be very relaxing. And as Bev pointed out, saw some research about increasing dopamine. A question from Dale: has anyone worked with a university's activity therapy department and or a school of OT or PT? That's a great question. If anyone has, please share those examples. And then another question for residents with expressive aphasia or cognitive impairment: what are recommended for them as far as activities? Any thoughts about that, or just kind of going back to the other resources that we mentioned?
I think maybe on a, certainly on a future call, we can even invite some activities professionals to, potentially talk about some different ideas that could be shared. But again, I do think that some of the resources that we have talked about already have included different kinds of examples of discussion groups, or, bringing in different, props or balls, or things that people use for different kinds of games, or as I mentioned earlier, like art classes or musicians that may come in and volunteer to do activities with different residents. There's a whole range of things that we've seen out there. I think maybe too many to mention in a broad general conversation, but there are a lot of resources that are available with some online searching. And I guess I would also go back to talking to the residents about what do they want to do? What are things that interest them that they want to be engaged in?
Yes, and I know it may be more challenging to ask residents with severe cognitive impairment what they'd like to do, but there are a ton of resources out there. I just dropped one example called Time Slips many years ago, many moons ago, when I was a local ombudsman program. This program was created, and it's fantastic. And it's specifically for those with moderate to severe cognitive impairment. And the idea around it is to, very simply, the website goes into more detail, but share this with your facilities. You show the residents a really whimsical picture, and you have, at least way back then, a flip chart or dry erase board or something to take notes, and you ask them what they see in the picture. And these residents as a group come up with this really creative and fun story. And it's just a way for them to be able to share what's on their mind, what they're thinking about, what they see, without anyone telling them they're wrong, they don't remember this, etc. So that was really an engaging activity, and I think Time Slips has expanded more as well with other activities on that website. So, and of course, I believe there's information on other websites as well, and we can pull those together, and like Lori suggested, maybe even work with the Activity Directors Association for a future call.
I would just put in one more plug for Residents' Rights Month. We just recently launched our annual Residents' Voice Challenge, where we do encourage residents to think about the theme for the year. And this year's theme is amplifying our advocacy, and thinking about how they think about that, how they can promote that. And we get so many different kinds of resources, or amplify our voices is the theme. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. Amplify our voices, but certainly we get all kinds of things, from artwork to poems to videos to songs to drawings, essays, where residents can really engage. And we do know that a number of them do work together on things that they can submit as well. And so we'll put a link to our Residents' Rights Month page in the chat, and please share that with the facilities that you're going with and encourage residents to participate and submit items for Residents' Rights Month this year.
Thanks, Lori. Yes, definitely try to get residents involved and share this information with activity directors as well and staff. We will include links that were shared in the chat in the webinar resources as well, so they're not just lost as soon as you log out. And I did see some comments about bringing items or contacting groups, and I just wanted to remind everyone, I know you know this, but Ombudsman, you bring ideas and share best practices with facilities, but you don't actually make the phone calls to the organizations to come volunteer or perform the activity yourself. So your role is to encourage them to do the best they can for residents. So with that, I want to make sure to call your attention to our contact information slide. Like I promised, there's Lori, Jocelyn, and Monique's contact information. Please reach out to them with additional questions. And as Monique said, she would create those questions that they ask on a routine visit with the SIP program and share those with us, and we'll share them with you. Next slide, please. If you are not already part of our email list, please click on that link once you get these slides, or copy it down and join as soon as you get off this call. This is how we're able to communicate directly with you, so you can learn about training opportunities and other resources and such that we put out. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, we do want to hear from you, not just about today's call, which of course we do want to know what you thought about today's call, if you thought it was helpful, what you're going to use from this call going forward, but we also want to hear what you want to discuss in the next quarterly call or even a virtual office hour. We have those monthly. However, just so you know, we do not have a virtual office hour this month, but we'll send another reminder about that as well. And here is the link to, oh, you already beat me to it. Thank you. She was making sure I didn't forget to drop in the link, because I always do. So there's the link to SurveyMonkey, where you can fill out the very brief evaluation. We would appreciate that. Connect with us if you don't already. We have an app that you can download, where the whole purpose of that was to give you very quick access to our resources when you're out in the field, as well as federal regs, guidance, and other things that you need at your fingertips. And then there is our website, and of course our social media links. So follow us, connect with us in all those ways, because we like to hear from you, and we learn, of course, a lot from you and what you're doing in the field, so we can share it with the network. So with that, I want to say thank you so much, Lori, Jocelyn, Monique. Thank you for sharing your experience, your expertise. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Libby and Katie, for working on all the background stuff for this call today. And thank you all for joining us. We always learn more from you, and we are very happy to be here as the Resource Center to support your work. So keep up the great work and all of your advocacy, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Take care.